As I reflect back on my memories of my grandpa, I realized that he left me with several life lessons. When I was young, he taught me the value of lifelong learning. He always loved his walks around the neighborhood. Some days I would see him as I walked home from school, and he would stop and look up at a tree or the birds flying in the sky. And he would study them in fine detail. At home, he enjoyed reading about alternative medicine and reflexology, and I would constantly see him rubbing pressure points on his hands and feet in order to treat specific ailments in his body. He lived a healthy 96 years, so he must have done something right. I also discovered early on that my grandpa's vocabulary was far better than mine because he spent countless hours reading the dictionary as a young boy to improve his English. My grandfather had a constant urge to improve his knowledge and better his mind, and I'm truly thankful for his example. As I got older, he taught me the importance of knowing who you are and where you came from. Every time I visited my grandparents, he would share his life stories with me. He would talk about his early days as a boy in rural China, his parents who were hardworking middle-class people, and many times he would boast about the achievements of my grandma, my dad, and my aunt and uncle. He was always so proud of his family. Several years ago, my grandpa gave me an unfinished copy of his memoir. After he passed, I decided to read it again. It consisted of memories growing up as a child to his teenage years. And these anecdotes really helped me piece together my family lineage. But more importantly, they helped me to really appreciate what each generation had done to pave the way for the next. As I pondered what to say today, I realized my grandpa had one final lesson for me. This lesson was neither spoken nor written, and it was likely unintended, but perhaps it was the most important lesson of all. Through his example, he taught me that he taught me that it's always better late than never. For decades, he supported my grandmother in her faith, but was never really 100% on board. And for decades, he held a bit of a resentment towards Christianity for events that occurred during his childhood. But through my grandmother's persistent prayers and God's will, my grandpa's heart transformed. And today, I can truly and confidently say that I know that my grandfather is in a better place. In my grandpa's memoirs, he quoted an unknown author, and it said, "Act, act, always act. Move persistently ahead to the goal." Uncle, on behalf of the Yaos and the Violas, we thank you for the time we were able to spend with you here on earth and all the lessons that you have taught us. Your passing has left a large void in our hearts, but I know as we reflect on our memories with you, our hearts will surely heal. We'll miss you, and we love you dearly. Yes, say hello to my dad.
My father, Yao Kok led a simple life, but in this life, he did at least 3 smart things. First, he had a good sense to marry my mother. Secondly, he kept a library in the English classics. And thirdly, he decided to live a very long life. The first smart thing my father ever did was to marry my mother. Marrying my mother was the smartest thing he ever did in his life. As a result, he got almost 67 years of partnership, companionship, and most of all, gourmet cooking. For as anyone who's been to my mother's Chinese New Year's dinners can attest to, my mother is indeed a master chef. And my father got all of that wonderful cooking for free. While most people have one dish or two dishes for lunch and dinner, they had 3 or 4. They ate better than Warren Buffett. And to the very last, he retained a healthy appetite. In addition, my mother was his major domo, managing the household. She always made her own money, and in many years she made as much, if not more, than him. Together they raised a family, my older brother Eric, my sister Susan, and me. They spawned grandchildren. They witnessed China's rise from a semi-colonized country with a puny backward economy to a major power and the world's #1 economy. Yep, that's what the World Bank says. The second smartest thing my father did, he kept a library in the English classics. He made a list of the best books in the language, English language, and he bought them, and he tried his best to read them. His small library in English included Shakespeare, Bernard Shaw, The Prince by Machiavelli, Don Quixote by Cervantes, The History of the English-Speaking Peoples by Winston Churchill, Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. It was not a Harry Potter library, and I was its great beneficiary. My father had no clue that I, in grade school, was devouring, plundering, expropriating his books, until one day he caught me reading from his library, a fat college textbook in world history. He said to me, "You like looking at the pictures in this book, right?" I said, "Yes," but I told him I was almost done reading the book. At that, he raised his eyebrows in disbelief. He started turning to random pages and making me read them, and then quiz me on them. After enough minutes of this interrogation, he said to me with rising alarm in his voice, "Do you realize your grandfather has to hire a PhD to tutor your third uncle on this book so he can pass his course in world history?" Then he ordered me, "Go out and play like the other kids." The third smartest thing my father did, he decided to live a very long life. It was very deliberate and very intentional. A few years ago, he was still hoping to hit 100, a century. Actually, he wouldn't have mind 120, in perfect health and vigor, of course. It's all very biblical, actually. Moses lived 120, so why shouldn't he? It's all very Chinese too. According to the Chinese legend, the beloved Emperor Yao, of whom he is a descendant, lived to be 120, or thereabouts. Longevity as the supreme good is unquestioned in Chinese civilization. The Chinese wish their emperors one sui, 10,000 years, and one sui, 10,000 times 10,000 years. As for Kok Su, he was able to take buses and subways and walk and lingered in Toronto well into his 90s. His mind was lucid to the very end. His last act before entering the hospital was to cast a vote in the last parliamentary elections. Sad to say, in my opinion, I think he might have voted for the wrong party. For most of his life, Yao Kok never needed physicians and hospitals, and stayed as far away from them as a matter of principle. My father was also an autodidact. He was a self-taught calligrapher,
Exhibit A.
a self-taught acupressurist, and a self-taught political analyst. In my childhood, my father gave calligraphy lessons to me and my sister, Susan. I thought that was pretty good, but my sister thought she was better. With a few lessons under my belt, I decided I'd already mastered the art of Chinese calligraphy. So I invoked the right to play with my calligraphy and try to turn it into modern art. Unfortunately, my grade school teacher did not get it at all. She took it as a personal insult and complained to my mother. I'm sure she wouldn't have liked Picasso either. One summer, after my first grade, my father gave me a handbook on English grammar. He said he'd learned his English grammar from this handbook, and I was to study it that summer. And so I did, and so I learned the fundamentals of English grammar from this little book and from reruns of the Three Stooges. Yao Kok was one of the best, most astute political analysts I've ever met, aside from me. But his political analysis was like singing in the showers, because he never expressed it outside his home. I'm the exact opposite. Late in life, he wrote his memoirs, but did not see fit to finish it, and all his writing was in Shakespearean English. I believe he is the last practitioner of Shakespearean English. So, the desire for creative expression and the intellectual curiosity were there in him, started with him, and trickled down to people like me. But they never came easy to him, nor did they experience full bloom in his life. Let's see if it does in mine. When my grandmother, my father's mother, died of cancer when I was 9, I developed a bad case of insomnia. It wasn't all bad, as I had an excuse and a permit to stay up all night. One night, my father said to me, "Don't worry about cancer. By the time you have to worry about cancer, the scientists would have found a cure." Well, those scientists had not found a cure when my brother Eric needed one. My father might well have said also, "Don't worry about growing old, because by the time you have to worry about it, science and medicine would have found a cure." In recent years, when he finally had to worry about strokes and old age, science and medicine failed him. And that's why we're here today, to celebrate and remember my father and his simple and long life.